Close your eyes and allow the whispers of history to surround you. Imagine a world cloaked in darkness, with the very essence of humanity hanging by a thin thread. Feel the weight of each syllable as we journey across the ages, as the terrible echoes of a single tragedy resound hauntingly. Join me as we peel back the layers of memory to discover a story of unspeakable grief, unyielding strength, and a steadfast spirit of resilience. This is more than a story, it is a tribute to the unbreakable human spirit, carved in the sands of time as the tragic saga of the Holocaust unfolds before our eyes. The Holocaust. The Holocaust was the genocide of European Jews during World War II. Between 1941 and 1945, Nazi Germany and its accomplices methodically murdered 6 million Jews in German-occupied Europe, accounting for roughly two-thirds of the Jewish population. Extermination camps in occupied Poland, including Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Belzec, Sobibor, and Chelmno, used mass shootings and poison gas to commit the atrocities. The Nazis seized power in early 1933 after developing their ideology centered on race and the search of living space. The administration implemented anti-Jewish laws, fostered harassment, and planned a statewide pogrom in November 1938, with the goal of forcing all German Jews, regardless of means, to attempt to escape. After Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, occupying authorities proceeded to set up ghettos to separate Jews. Following the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, 1.5 to 2 million Jews were killed by German forces and local collaborators. Later in 1941 or early 1942, the top levels of the German administration determined to exterminate all Jews across Europe. Victims were transported by train to extermination camps, where, if they survived the voyage, the majority were killed with poison gas. Other Jews were still working in forced labor camps, where many died of famine, torture, weariness, or being exploited as test subjects in lethal medical experiments. Although many Jews attempted to flee, surviving and hiding proved difficult due to issues such as a lack of funds to pay helpers and the fear of being denounced. The property, residences, and jobs of killed Jews were given to German occupiers and non-Jews. Although the majority of Holocaust victims perished in 1942, the slaughter continued at a slower pace until the war's end in May 1945. Separate Nazi persecutions killed a comparable or greater number of non-Jewish citizens and POWs. The term Holocaust is sometimes used to describe the persecution of these other populations. Many Jewish survivors emigrated from Europe after the war. Several Holocaust offenders faced criminal charges. Billions of dollars in reparations have been paid, yet they fall short of covering the Jewish losses. The Holocaust has also been remembered through museums, memorials, and culture. It has become an iconic symbol of the ultimate human wickedness in Western history. Terminology and scope. The term Holocaust, derived from a Greek word meaning burnt offering, has become the most widely used term in English and other languages to describe the Nazi genocide of Jews. The term Holocaust is also used to refer to the persecution of various groups targeted by the Nazis, particularly those targeted on biological grounds, such as the Roma and Sinti, as well as Soviet prisoners of war and Polish and Soviet civilians. All of these groups were targeted for a variety of reasons. By the 1970s, the adjective Jewish was deleted as unnecessary, and Holocaust, now capitalized, became the conventional phrase for the slaughter of European Jews. The Hebrew phrase Shoah, catastrophic destruction, refers solely to Jewish victims. The perpetrators used the word final solution as a euphemism for Jewish genocide. Background. Jews have lived in Europe for over 2 millennia. Throughout the Middle Ages in Europe, Jews faced anti-Semitism based on Christian theology, which condemned them for killing Jesus. During the 19th century, many European countries granted Jews full citizenship privileges in the expectation that they would assimilate. By the early 20th century, most Jews in Central and Western Europe were well integrated into society. However, in Eastern Europe, where liberation came later, many Jews still lived in tiny villages, spoke Yiddish, and practiced Orthodox Judaism. Political anti-Semitism positing the presence of a Jewish question and, often, An international Jewish conspiracy evolved in the 18th and 19th centuries due to the emergence of nationalism in Europe. And industrialization exacerbated economic disputes between Jews and non-Jews. Some scientists began to divide mankind into races and claimed that there was a life-or-death conflict between them. Many racists claimed that Jews were a distinct racial group not native to Europe. At the turn of the 20th century, there was a concerted drive to construct a German colonial empire overseas, which resulted in the Herero and Nama genocides and the ensuing racial apartheid government in Southwest Africa. World War I, 1914–1918, fueled nationalist and racist attitudes in Germany and other European countries. Pogroms were carried out against Jews throughout Eastern Europe. Germany suffered 2 million war dead and lost a significant amount of territory. Opposition to the post-war settlement united Germans from all political parties. The military propagated the false but persuasive notion that, rather than being vanquished on the battlefield, Germany had been stabbed in the back by socialists and Jews. The Nazi Party was created in the aftermath of the war, and its ideology is sometimes recognized as the primary cause of the Holocaust. The Nazis, like other European nation-states, envisioned a world free of Jews, whom they saw as the embodiment of everything that was wrong with modernity from the start. The Nazis defined the German nation as a racial group that was not limited by Germany's geographical borders and intended to rid it of racially and socially inferior components. The Nazi Party and its leader, Adolf Hitler, were likewise obsessed with restoring Germany's territorial losses and gaining more Lebensraum, living space, in Eastern Europe for colonization. Many Germans found these concepts appealing. The Nazis swore to defend European civilization against the Soviet threat. Hitler claimed that Jews controlled both the Soviet Union and Western nations, and that they were preparing to destroy Germany. The rise of Nazi Germany. Despite a global economic slump and political disintegration, the Nazi Party swiftly gained its support, reaching a peak of 37% in mid-1932 elections by campaigning on anti-communism and economic recovery. Hitler was chosen chancellor in January 1933 through a backroom pact backed by right-wing lawmakers. 38. Within months, all other political organizations were banned, the state gained control of the media, tens of thousands of political opponents, particularly communists, were jailed, and a network of extrajudicial detention camps was established. The Nazi dictatorship used a range of methods, including concentration camps, to combat criminality and social outcasts such as Roma and Sinti, homosexual males, and those thought to be lazy. The Nazis sterilized 400,000 people and forced others to have abortions for genuine or alleged inherited diseases. Although the Nazis aimed to regulate all aspects of public and private life, their persecution was almost solely directed at groups believed to be outside the national community. As long as they did not oppose the new regime, the majority of Germans had little to worry. Economic growth was a key component of the new regime's strategy to win over the public, which included state-led initiatives like rearmament. Nazi popularity also rose as a result of the annexations of Austria, 1938, the Sudetenland, 1938, and Bohemia and Moravia, 1939. Propaganda against Jews and other groups targeted by the Nazis flooded German minds. Jewish persecution. In 1933, the approximate 500,000 German Jews accounted for fewer than 1% of the nation's total population. With the exception of a small percentage of recent immigrants from Eastern Europe, they were generally wealthier and more assimilated than other Germans. Approximately 1,500 anti-Jewish laws were enacted by various German government agencies, Nazi Party organizations, and municipal authorities. Jews were prohibited or limited from entering the civil service and several professions in 1933. The Nuremberg laws were passed in 1935 by the dictatorship, which had by then driven the German Jews from public life by the end of 1934. The rules forbade Jews from entering into new marriages or engaging in sexual relations with non-Jewish Germans, restricted Jews' ability to engage in the economy, and reserved full citizenship rights for those of German or related blood. 3 or 4 Jewish ancestors were required to be considered Jewish, and many people with some Jewish ancestry were categorized as Mischlinge, having different rights. In addition, the dictatorship worked to separate Jews in anticipation of their eventual extermination from the nation. Jewish pupils were progressively expelled from the educational system. Certain localities implemented regulations that limited the areas in which Jews may reside or operate their businesses. Jews were forced out of the economy in 1938 and 1939 when they were prohibited from working in other professions and had their enterprises taken away from them. Mostly non-lethal, anti-Jewish violence was organized locally between 1933 and 1939 by members of Nazi Party institutions. Jews' stores were frequently targeted for boycotts or vandalism, particularly in rural areas. Local and public pressure led to the complete elimination of Jews from several small towns, and it's possible that up to one-third of Jewish-owned enterprises were forced to close. In regions that Nazi Germany acquired, anti-Semitic violence was considerably more pervasive. The Nazis staged a national pogrom known as Kristallnacht, or Night of Broken Glass, on November 9 to 10, 1938. At least 90 Jews were killed, more than 1,000 synagogues were damaged or destroyed, over 7,500 Jewish stores, out of 9,000, were robbed, and up to 30,000 Jewish men were detained. Many of them were freed within a few weeks. A special tax imposed on German Jews brought in over 1 billion Reichsmarks, RM. The goal of the Nazi regime was to expel all Jews from Germany. The majority of Jews who were able to emigrate had already done so by the end of 1939. Those who stayed behind were disproportionately old, poor, or female, and thus were unable to secure a visa. About 110,000 of them fled to the United States, the remainder to South America, Shanghai, Mandatory Palestine, and South Africa. Nearly 1 billion RM in emigration taxes were collected by Germany, primarily from Jews. Forced migration was a strategy that persisted until 1940. In addition to Germany, a large number of other European nations gave up democracy in favor of authoritarian or fascist governance. In the 1930s and 1940s, anti-Semitic laws were passed in a large number of nations, including Slovakia, Hungary, Poland, Bulgaria, Romania, and Romania. Due to a Polish law that permitted Polish Jews residing abroad to have their citizenship revoked, Germany deported a large number of Polish Jews in October 1938. Start of World War II. The German Wehrmacht, armed forces, invaded Poland on September 1, 1939, prompting declarations of war from the United Kingdom and France. During the 5 weeks of warfare, the German invaders may have shot up to 16,000 civilians, captives, and prisoners of war. There was also widespread looting. Special forces known as Einsatzgruppen followed the army to kill any potential resistance. Approximately 50,000 Polish and Polish Jewish leaders and intellectuals were detained or killed. The Auschwitz concentration camp was built to house members of the Polish intelligentsia who were not slain during the purges. Between 1939 and 1941, around 400,000 Poles were expelled from the Wartheland in western Poland to the General Governorate occupation zone. The area was resettled by ethnic Germans from Eastern Europe. The Soviet Union annexed the rest of Poland, invading from the east on September 17 in accordance with the German-Soviet deal. The Soviet Union exiled hundreds of thousands of Polish citizens to the Soviet interior, including up to 260,000 Jews, most of whom survived the war. Although the majority of Jews were not communists, some took posts in the Soviet government, adding to many non-Jews' preconceived notion that Soviet leadership was a Jewish plot. In 1940, Germany attacked most of Western Europe, including the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, France, Denmark, and Norway. In 1941, Germany invaded Yugoslavia and Greece. Some of these new territories were wholly or partially annexed by Germany, while others were put under civilian or military control. The war provided cover for the murder of around 70,000 institutionalized Germans with mental or physical disabilities in specialized killing facilities employing poison gas. The victims consisted of all 4,000 to 5,000 institutionalized Jews. Despite efforts to keep the execution secret, word spread, and Hitler ordered an end to the coordinated death operation in August 1941. Decentralized killings, including denial of medical care, hunger, and poisoning, resulted in an additional 120,000 deaths by the end of the conflict. Many of the same persons and technologies were later employed in the mass murder of Jews. Ghettoization and resettlement. Germany took control of 1.7 million Jews in Poland. The Nazis attempted to concentrate Jews in the Lublin district of the General Governorate. 45,000 Jews were transported by November and left to fend for themselves, resulting in numerous deaths. Deportations ceased in early 1940 due to objections from Hans Frank, the commander of the General Governorate, who did not want his domain to become a dump for undesired Jews. Following the takeover of France, the Nazis considered deporting Jews to French Madagascar, but this was impossible. The Nazis intended that the terrible conditions in these places would kill many Jews. During the invasion, synagogues were destroyed, and hundreds of Jews fled or were expelled to the Soviet occupation zone. Several anti-Jewish regulations were quickly enacted. In October 1939, adult Jews in the General Governorate were obliged to work. In November 1939, they were instructed to wear white armbands. Most Jewish property was confiscated, and Jewish-owned enterprises were taken over under law. Jews were pushed into ghettos, where they lost their homes and possessions. The first Nazi ghettos were constructed in the Wartheland and General Governorate in 1939 and 1940 at the request of local German officials. The greatest ghettos, such as Warsaw and Lodz, were constructed in existing residential neighborhoods and surrounded by gates or walls. In many smaller ghettos, Jews were confined into impoverished communities with no fencing. Forced labor programs provided subsistence for many ghetto residents and, in certain cases, safeguarded them from deportation. Some ghettos housed workshops and industries, while others required Jews to leave the ghetto to work elsewhere. Because the ghettos were not segregated by gender, some family life persisted. A Jewish community leadership, Judenrat, exercised some autonomy and attempted to maintain the Jewish community while adhering to German expectations. As a survival strategy, many attempted to make the ghettos useful to the invaders as a labor reserve. Western Europe's Jews were not forced into ghettos, but they were subjected to discriminatory laws and property confiscation. Rape and sexual exploitation of Jewish and non-Jewish women was widespread throughout Eastern Europe. Invasion of Soviet Union. Germany and its allies, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Italy, attacked the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941. Although the war was initiated for strategic rather than ideological reasons, Hitler saw it as an apocalyptic conflict against the forces of Jewish Bolshevism, and it was to be carried out as an extermination war with utter disregard for military regulations and customs. A fast victory was envisaged, followed by a vast population engineering operation that would remove 31 million people and replace them with German settlers. To speed up the takeover, the Germans planned to feed their soldiers by robbing, export additional food to Germany, and scare the locals with preventative executions. The Germans anticipated that the invasion would result in a food shortage and planned the mass starving of Soviet cities and certain rural areas. Although the starving campaign was less successful than planners had planned, populations of some cities, particularly in Ukraine and besieged Leningrad, as well as Jewish ghettos, suffered from man-made famine, resulting in the deaths of millions. Masha Bruskina, a Belarusian Jew who helped Soviet captives escape, was publicly executed. The German army intended to kill a large number of Soviet prisoners of war in its captivity. 60%, 3.3 million people, died, mostly from famine, making them the second greatest group of victims of Nazi mass murder after European Jews. Jewish prisoners of war and commissars were systematically killed. The Nazis slaughtered almost 1 million citizens during anti-partisan combat, including over 300,000 in Belarus. Since 1942, the Germans and their allies have attacked villages accused of helping the partisans, burning them and killing or displacing their residents. During these operations, nearby minor ghettos were dismantled and their residents executed. By 1943, anti-partisan operations intended to depopulate huge parts of Belarus. Jews and those unsuitable for work were often executed on the spot, while others were deported. Although the majority of those slaughtered were not Jews, anti-partisan violence frequently resulted in the killings of Jews. Mass shootings of Jews. The systematic extermination of Jews in the Soviet Union began in 1941. During the invasion, several Jews were drafted into the Red Army. Of the 10 to 15 million Soviet people who fled eastward to the Soviet heartland, 1.6 million were Jewish. Locals slaughtered up to 50,000 Jews in pogroms in Latvia, Lithuania, eastern Poland, Ukraine, and the Romanian borders. Although German forces attempted to provoke pogroms, their role in the bloodshed is debatable. By April 1942, Romanian soldiers had killed tens of thousands of Jews from Odessa. Prior to the invasion, the Einsatzgruppen were reformed in preparation for mass killings, with instructions to shoot Soviet officials as well as Jewish state and party employees. The shootings were justified on the basis of Jews' alleged vital role in maintaining the communist system, but it was not originally planned to kill all Soviet Jews. The occupiers depended on locals to identify and attack Jews. The first German mass executions targeted adult male Jews who had previously worked as civil servants or in education-related positions. Tens of thousands had been shot by the end of July. The great majority of civilian casualties were Jewish. In July and August, Heinrich Himmler, the SS Schutzstaffel head, paid repeated visits to the death squad's operating areas, transmitting orders to kill more Jews. At this point, the assassins began to slaughter Jewish women and children. In August and September, executions peaked at 40,000 a month in Lithuania, while in October and November they peaked in Belarus. Executions were frequently carried out several kilometers from a town. Victims were picked up, marched to the execution place, and forced to strip and blasted into already excavated trenches. The preferred procedure was to shoot the back of the neck with a single bullet. During the confusion, many people were buried alive rather than murdered by gunfire. Typically, the trenches were guarded after the execution, but occasionally a few victims were able to escape. Executions were public spectacles, and both the occupants and locals plundered the victims' goods. The seized Soviet Union constructed approximately 200 ghettos, many of which existed very briefly before their people were killed. Several big ghettos, including Vilna, Kovna, Riga, Białystok, and Lwów, remained in operation until 1943 as production centers. The victims of mass shootings included Jews who had been deported from elsewhere. Aside from Germany, Romania was responsible for the most Jewish deaths. Between 1941 and 1943, Romania deported around 154,000 to 170,000 Jews from Bessarabia and Bukovina to Transnistrian ghettos. Jews from Transnistria were also imprisoned in these ghettos, where the total death toll could have been 160,000. In 1941, Hungary exiled hundreds of Carpathian, Ruthenian and international Jews, who were executed shortly thereafter in Ukraine. Hitler ordered that all German Jews wear a yellow star beginning in September, and in October, he determined to deport them to the east and prohibit emigration altogether. Between October and December 1941, 42,000 Jews from Germany and its annexed areas and 5,000 Romani people from Austria were deported to Lodz, Kovna, Riga, and Minsk. In late November, 5,000 German Jews were slaughtered outside of Kovna and another 1,000 near Riga, although Himmler ordered an end to such atrocities, and several senior Nazi commanders expressed reservations about executing German Jews. Executions of German Jews in the Baltic states resumed in early 1942. After the killings expanded to include the whole Soviet Jewish community, the Einsatzgruppen 3,000 soldiers proved insufficient, so Himmler deployed 21 battalions of order police to help them. In addition, Wehrmacht soldiers, Waffen-SS units, and local auxiliaries killed many Jews. By the end of 1941, more than 80% of the Jews in central Ukraine, eastern Belarus, Russia, Latvia, and Lithuania were shot. However, less than 25% of those living farther west, where there were 900,000 people, survived. By the end of the war, between 1.5 to 2 million Jews had been killed, as had up to 225,000 Roma. The murderers found the executions upsetting and logistically inconvenient, prompting them to move to other means of killing. Systematic deportations throughout Europe. Most historians agree that Hitler issued an unambiguous command to kill all Jews in Europe, but they vary on when. Some historians argue that Hitler and other Nazi officials' incendiary speeches, as well as the simultaneous mass murders of Serbian Jews, planning for extermination camps in Poland, and the start of the deportation of German Jews, indicate that the final decision was taken before December 1941. Others say that these programs were initiated by local authorities, with the ultimate choice made later. On December 5, 1941, the Soviet Union launched its first major counteroffensive. Hitler declared war on the United States on December 11, following Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor. The following day, Hitler informed top Nazi Party members, referring to his 1939 prognosis, "The World War is here. The annihilation of the Jews must be the necessary consequence." It took the Nazis several months to plan a continental-scale genocide. Reinhard Heydrich, head of the Reich Main Security Office, RSJ, called the Wannsee Conference on January 20, 1942. This high-level gathering aimed to coordinate anti-Jewish strategy. The majority of Holocaust killings occurred in 1942, with 20 to 25% of victims dying before early 1942 and the same amount surviving by the end of the year. Extermination camps. Gas vans, adapted from those used to execute mental patients since 1939, were allocated to the Einsatzgruppen and initially utilized in November 1941. Victims were forced inside the van and killed by engine exhaust. The first extermination camp was Chelmno in the Wartheland, founded by local civil administrator Arthur Greiser with Himmler's approval. It commenced operations in December 1941 utilizing gas vans. In October 1941, higher SS and police leader of Lublin Odilo Globoknik began work on the Belzec, the first purpose-built extermination camp to incorporate stationary gas chambers employing carbon monoxide, based on the earlier Action T4 program, as German administrators in Poland discussed large-scale Jewish murder in the General Governorate. At late 1941, Jews at forced labor camps run by the Schmelt organization who were deemed unfit for work began to be transported in groups to Auschwitz, where they were killed. Zyklon B became the main technique of execution in extermination camps in early 1942, following gassing experiments on Russian POWs in late August 1941. The camps were built along railroad tracks to make it easier to transport Jews to their deaths, yet in remote locations to evade detection. Anyone around may smell the odor from the mass killing operations. Except during deportations from Western and Central Europe, people were often transported to camps in overcrowded cattle carriages. Up to 150 individuals were squeezed into a single boxcar. Many people perished en route, owing in part to the low emphasis given to these modes of transportation. Deportations were occasionally postponed or cancelled due to a lack of rail transportation. Upon arriving, the victims were stripped of their last belongings, forced to undress, have their hair chopped, and chased into the gas chamber. Death from gas was excruciating and may take up to 30 minutes. The gas chambers were crude and occasionally malfunctioned. Some detainees were shot because the gas chambers did not work. In other extermination camps, practically everyone on a transport was killed upon arrival, but at Auschwitz, approximately 20 to 25% were separated for labor, but many of these captives died later from starvation, mass shooting, torture, and medical experiments. Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka reported a total revenue of Rm 178.7 million from stolen property from their victims, considerably exceeding costs. The camps required the labor of less than 3,000 Jewish captives, 1,000 Traniki soldiers, mostly Ukrainian auxiliaries, and extremely few German guards. Poison gas killed roughly half of the Jews who died during the Holocaust. Thousands of Romani people were also killed in the extermination camps. Prisoner uprisings at Treblinka and Sobibor resulted in its closure earlier than planned. Liquidation of the ghettos in Poland. Plans to kill the majority of Jews in the General Governorate were influenced by the SS, military, and civil administration's goals of reducing Jewish food consumption, allowing for a tiny increase in non-Jewish Poles' rations, and combating the black market. In March 1942, executions began in Belzec, mostly targeting Jews from Lublin who were unable to work. This measure apparently lowered the underground market and was regarded successful enough to be duplicated elsewhere. By mid-1942, Nazi commanders had resolved to allow just 300,000 Jews to remain in the general governorate as forced labor by the end of the year. For the most part, only those engaged in armaments manufacture were spared. The bulk of ghettos were eliminated in mass killings, particularly if they were not close to a train station. Larger ghettos were often exterminated during multiple deportations to extermination camps. During this campaign, 1.5 million Polish Jews were slaughtered, making it the biggest killing operation of the Holocaust. To reduce resistance, the ghetto was raided without warning, generally in the early morning, and the scope of the operation was kept hidden as long as possible. Traniki men would cordon off the ghetto while the order police and security police carried out the operation. In addition to local non-Jewish collaborators, Jewish councils and Jewish ghetto police were frequently summoned to help with liquidation operations, though these Jews were typically executed afterward. Chaotic, erratic selections determined who would be loaded aboard the trains. Many Jews were killed during the conflict, leaving ghettos littered with corpses. Jewish slave laborers were responsible for cleaning up and collecting any valuables from the victims. The Warsaw Ghetto was cleared between July 22 and September 12. Of the original 350,000 Jews, 250,000 were slaughtered at Treblinka, 11,000 were transported to work camps, 10,000 were shot in the ghetto, 35,000 were allowed to stay in the ghetto after a final selection, and around 20,000 or 25,000 managed to hide in the ghetto. Misdirection tactics convinced many Jews that they could evade deportation until it was too late. 300,000 Jews from the Radom district were deported to Treblinka over the course of 6 weeks starting in August. At the same time as Jews were being massacred in the general governorate, Jews in ghettos to the west and east were targeted. Tens of thousands of Jews were transferred from Warthegau and East Upper Silesia ghettos to Chelmno and Auschwitz. 300,000 Jews, mostly skilled laborers, were massacred in Volhynia, Podolia, and southeastern Belarus. Deportations and mass killings in Białystok and Galicia resulted in the deaths of numerous Jews, 249, although there was little opposition in the general governorate in 1942. Some Soviet Jews improvised weapons and fought those attempting to destroy the ghetto, setting it on fire. These ghetto uprisings occurred only after the people began to think that their deaths were inevitable. In 1943, major uprisings in Warsaw, Białystok, and Głubokocz required the employment of heavy weapons. The Warsaw Uprising drove the Nazi leadership to abolish more ghettos and labor camps in German-occupied Poland, with their residents either massacred, as in the Wała massacre, or transported to extermination camps, for fear of further Jewish resistance. Nevertheless, in early 1944, nearly 70,000 Jews were compelled to work in the general governorate. Deportations from elsewhere. Unlike the killing zones in the East, deportation from other parts of Europe was centrally managed in Berlin, but it was contingent on the outcome of discussions with Allied countries and popular responses to deportation. Beginning in late 1941, local administrators responded to the deportation of Jews in their area by massacring local Jews to make room in ghettos for the deportees. If the transported Jews did not perish as a result of the severe conditions, they were eventually exterminated in extermination camps. Jews sent to Auschwitz were first admitted to the camp. The practice of selecting and executing many detainees upon arrival began in July 1942. In May and June, German and Slovak Jews deported to Lublin began being transported directly to extermination camps. In Western Europe, practically all Jewish deaths happened after expulsion. The Germans frequently depended on local police to arrest Jews, which limited the number of deportees. In 1942, around 100,000 Jews were deported from Belgium, France, and the Netherlands. Only 25% of Jews in France were slain. The majority were non-citizens or new immigrants. The Netherlands had a greater fatality rate than surrounding countries, which researchers have linked to difficulties in concealment or increased involvement by the Dutch police. The German government wanted to deport Jews from Allied countries. Slovakia was the first to hand over its Jewish population, arresting and deporting around 58,000 Jews to Poland between March and October 1942. The independent state of Croatia has previously executed or massacred in concentration camps the majority of its Jewish inhabitants, along with a larger number of Serbs, and later deported thousands of Jews in 1942 and 1943. Bulgaria deported 11,000 Jews from Bulgarian-occupied Greece and Yugoslavia, who were slaughtered in Treblinka, but refused to allow Jews to be transported from its pre-war territories. Romania and Hungary did not send any Jews, despite having the greatest remaining numbers after 1942. Prior to the German conquest of Italy in September 1943, no substantial attempts were made to deport Italian Jews, and Italy refused to allow Jews to be deported from numerous Italian-occupied areas. Nazi Germany made no attempt to destroy Finnish Jews or North African Jews who were under French or Italian sovereignty. Perpetrators and beneficiaries. An estimated 200,000 to 250,000 Germans were personally involved in the murder of Jews, and if all those involved in extermination planning are included, the figure climbs to 500,000. Genocide necessitated the active and implicit consent of millions of Germans and non-Germans. The motivations of Holocaust perpetrators vary, resulting in historiographical dispute. According to studies of the SS leaders who organized the Holocaust, the majority were ideologically committed to Nazism. In addition to ideological motivations, many criminals were driven by the chance of financial gain and social progress. German SS, police, and regular army divisions rarely struggled to recruit enough personnel to shoot Jewish citizens, even when the penalty for refusal was absent or mild. Non-German culprits and collaborators included Dutch and French, Polish police officers, Romanian soldiers, foreign SS and police auxiliaries, Ukrainian insurgent army partisans, and a few civilians also participated. Some were compelled into conducting violence against Jews, while others were killed for pleasure, money rewards, the prospect of better treatment from the occupiers, or ideological reasons such as nationalism and anti-communism. According to historian Christian Gerlach, non-Germans, not under German command, were responsible for 5 to 6% of Jewish killings and played an important role in other ways. Millions of Germans and others profited from the genocide. Despite the fact that the Holocaust revenues were recognized as state property, corruption was prevalent within the SS. Various German state institutions competed to receive goods looted from Jews dead in concentration camps. Many workers were able to take better occupations that had been vacated by slain Jews. Businessmen benefited from removing their Jewish competition or acquiring Jewish-owned enterprises. Others seized Jewish-owned homes and belongings. Some Poles who lived near the extermination camps later excavated human remains in quest of riches. The property of deported Jews was also taken up by Germany's allies and cooperating states. Even puppet states like Vichy France and Norway were successful in claiming Jewish property. In the decades following the war, Swiss banks became known for storing gold stolen by Nazis during the Holocaust and benefiting from unclaimed deposits made by Holocaust victims. Forced labor. Beginning in 1938, particularly in Germany and its annexed regions, many Jews were recruited into forced labor camps and segregated work assignments. These camps were often transient in nature and were typically controlled by civilian officials. Initially, mortality did not rise drastically. After mid-1941, conditions for Jewish forced laborers deteriorated significantly, and death rates rose. Even private companies purposefully exposed workers to homicidal conditions. Beginning in 1941 and growing over time, Jews capable of employment were isolated from others, who were typically exterminated. They were usually employed in low-skilled jobs and could be quickly replaced if non-Jewish workers became available, while those in skilled positions had a better chance of survival. Although conditions varied greatly between camps, Jewish forced laborers were consistently treated worse than non-Jewish captives and had far higher mortality rates. In mid-1943, Himmler attempted to bring remaining Jewish slave laborers under SS control within the concentration camp system. Some forced labor camps for Jews and ghettos, like Askovna, were named concentration camps, while others were closed and surviving captives relocated to concentration camps. Despite countless deaths, up to 200,000 Jews survived the war in concentration camps. Although the majority of Holocaust victims were never imprisoned in concentration camps, the picture of these camps is a well-known symbol of the Holocaust. 13 million people, including Soviet prisoners of war, were compelled to work in Germany. Except for Roma and Jews, the largest nationalities were Soviet and Polish, who were also the worst-treated minority. Forced workers in the Soviet Union and Poland were subjected to inadequate food and medical care, as well as hard hours and boss harassment. Hundreds of thousands have died. Many others were forced to work for the occupiers while remaining in their home country. Some of Germany's allies, like Slovakia and Hungary, consented to deport Jews in order to safeguard non-Jews from forced labor demands by Germany. East European women were also kidnapped by Lepenka and forced to work as sex slaves for German soldiers in military and camp brothels, despite the restriction on connections, including fraternization, between German and foreign labor, which carried the penalty of imprisonment or death. Escape and hiding. Gerlach thinks that 200,000 Jews survived in hiding throughout Europe. Knowledge of German intentions was required to take action, but many people failed to believe the news. Many people attempted to jump off trains or flee ghettos and camps, but escaping and living in concealment was exceedingly difficult and frequently failed. Local support, or the absence of active opposition, was critical but frequently inadequate in Eastern Europe. Those in hiding needed the help of non-Jews. Money, social links with non-Jews, a non-Jewish appearance, full mastery of the local language, determination, and luck all played important roles in deciding survival. Jews in hiding were tracked down with the help of local collaborators, and incentives were given for their testimony. People who hid them were occasionally sentenced to death, particularly in Eastern Europe. Rescuers' objectives ranged from generosity to seeking sex or material gain. It was not uncommon for helpers to betray or murder Jews if their funds ran out. Gerlach contends that hundreds of thousands of Jews may have died as a result of rumors or denunciations, and that many others never attempted to flee because they believed it was impossible. Most European countries' resistance movements included Jews, who were frequently overrepresented. Jews were not always welcome, especially in nationalist resistance organizations, some of which killed Jews. Many Jews joined the Soviet partisans, particularly in Belarus, where the topography was conducive with lush forests, an estimated 20,000 to 25,000 across the Soviet Union. An additional 10,000 to 13,000 Jewish non-combatants lived in family camps in Eastern European woodlands, the most well-known being the Bielski partisans. International reactions. The Nazi authorities were aware that their conduct would draw international censure. On June 26, 1942, BBC services in all languages broadcast a report written by the Jewish Social Democratic Bund and other resistance groups and distributed by the Polish government in exile, which documented the massacre of 700,000 Jews in Poland. In December 1942, the Allies, then known as the United Nations, issued a unified resolution condemning the systematic extermination of Jews. Throughout the war, most neutral European countries pursued a pro-German foreign policy. Nonetheless, some Jews were able to flee to neutral countries, with measures ranging from rescue to non-action. During the war, the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, JDC, raised $70 million, and in the years following, $300 million. This money was used to help emigration and provide direct relief in the shape of parcels and other items to Jews living under German rule, as well as Holocaust survivors after the war. After entering the war, the United States prohibited the sending of help into German-occupied Europe, but the JDC continued to do so. Between 1939 and 1944, the JDC helped 81,000 European Jews emigrate. Second half of the war. Continuing killings. Following German military failures in 1943, it became increasingly clear that Germany would lose the war. In early 1943, 45,000 Jews were transferred from German-occupied northern Greece, predominantly Salonika, to Auschwitz, where almost all were murdered. After Italy switched sides in late 1943, Germany deported several thousand Jews from Italy and previous Italian occupation zones in France, Yugoslavia, Albania, and Greece, with minimal success. Attempts to resume deportations in Western Europe after 1942 frequently failed due to Jews fleeing into hiding and local authorities' growing reluctance. In the face of a half-hearted German deportation attempt in late 1943, the Danish resistance assisted the majority of Danish Jews in escaping to Sweden. Additional massacres in 1943 and 1944 liquidated all the remaining ghettos and the majority of Eastern Europe's remaining Jews. Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka were closed down and destroyed. The largest murder action after 1942 was committed against Hungarian Jews, 369. Following the German invasion of Hungary in 1944, the Hungarian government worked closely with the Nazis to deport 437,000 Jews in 8 weeks, the majority of whom were sent to Auschwitz. The confiscation of Jewish property served Hungarian economic aims, and deploying Jews as forced workers eliminated the need to send non-Jewish Hungarians. Those who made it through the selection process were forced to work in construction and manufacturing as a last-ditch effort to improve fighter aircraft production. Although the Nazis had mostly achieved their goal of eradicating the Jewish population from Germany in 1943, it was reversed in 1944 due to the importation of these Jews for labor. Death marches and liberation. Following Allied advances, the SS transferred concentration camp captives to facilities in Germany and Austria, beginning in mid-1944 with the Baltics. Weak and ailing captives were frequently executed in the camp, while others were forced to go by train or foot, often with no or insufficient food. Those who were unable to keep up were shot. The evacuations were commanded to keep the captives as forced labor while also preventing any prisoners from falling into enemy hands. Between October and November 1944, 90,000 Jews were evacuated from Budapest to the Austrian border. The transfer of prisoners from Auschwitz began in mid-1944. The gas chambers were shut down and demolished after October, and in January, the majority of the remaining 67,000 Auschwitz captives were transported on a death march westward. More than 700,000 individuals were imprisoned in concentration camps in January 1945, with up to one-third of them dying before the war ended. At the time, the majority of concentration camp inmates were Soviet and Polish citizens who had been detained for actual or alleged resistance or seeking to flee forced labor. The death marches caused a breakdown in supplies for the remaining camps, resulting in additional deaths. Although there was no systematic murdering of Jews during the death marches, an estimated 70,000 to 100,000 Jews perished in the final months of the war. Many of the survivors of the death marches wound up in other concentration camps, which were freed in 1945 after the Western Allied assault of Germany. The liberators discovered stacks of corpses and had to bulldoze them into mass graves. Some survivors were rescued there, while others were liberated by the Red Army as it marched westward. The death toll. Approximately 6 million Jews were slaughtered, the majority of those killed were from Eastern Europe, with Poland accounting for half of the total. Approximately 1.3 million Jews who had previously lived under Nazi control or with one of Germany's allies survived the war. One-third of the world's Jewish population, including two-thirds of European Jews, had been exterminated. Death rates fluctuated greatly due to a variety of circumstances, approaching 100% in some locations. Survival odds fluctuated depending on the possibility of emigration and assistance from Germany's allies, which saved approximately 600,000 Jews. Jewish children and the elderly had worse survival rates than adults. The bloodiest phase of the Holocaust was Operation Reinhard, which saw the establishment of extermination camps. Approximately 2 million Jews were slaughtered between March 1942 and November 1943. Between July and October 1942, about 1.47 million Jews were massacred, which is almost 83% greater than the widely accepted figure for the Rwandan genocide. Separate Nazi persecutions killed an equal or greater number of non-Jewish citizens and POWs, with Gerlach estimating 6 to 8 million, Gilbert more than 10 million, and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum more than 11 million. In certain nations, like as Hungary, Jews constituted the majority of civilian deaths. In Poland, they were either the majority or around half. In several nations, including the Soviet Union, France, Greece, and Yugoslavia, non-Jewish civilian casualties outweighed Jewish deaths. Aftermath and legacy. Return home and emigrate. Following liberation, many Jews attempted to return home. Limited success in locating family, the refusal of many non-Jews to restore property, and violent attacks such as the Kielce pogrom led many survivors to flee Eastern Europe. Anti-Semitism was claimed to rise in various countries following the war, owing to disagreements about property restoration. When the war ended, there were less than 28,000 German Jews and 60,000 non-German Jews in Germany. By 1947, the number of Jews in Germany had risen to 250,000 as a result of communist authorities allowing emigration from Eastern Europe. Jews accounted for approximately 25% of the population in displaced persons camps. Despite their bad health, several survivors attempted to form self-government in these camps, including schooling and rehabilitation programs. Because other countries refused to allow their immigration, many survivors remained in Germany until 1948, when Israel was established. Others went to the United States around 1950 as immigration restrictions were relaxed. Criminal trials. Most Holocaust criminals were never tried for their crimes. During World War II, numerous European countries conducted large purges of real and perceived collaborators, affecting up to 2 to 3% of Europe's population, albeit the majority of the following trials did not focus on crimes against Jews. Nazi atrocities prompted the United Nations Genocide Convention in 1948. However, it was not used in Holocaust trials due to the non-retroactivity of criminal law. The International Military Tribunal tried 23 Nazi leaders between 1945 and 1946, largely for initiating wars of aggression, which the prosecution claimed was at the basis of Nazi criminality. Nonetheless, the systematic slaughter of Jews came to the forefront. This trial, along with others held by the Allies in occupied Germany, the United States Army alone accused 1,676 individuals in 462 war crimes trials, were largely seen by the German population as an unjust form of political retribution. West Germany later investigated 100,000 people and tried over 6,000 defendants, the majority of whom were minor offenders. Adolf Eichmann, a high-level organizer, was captured and tried in Israel in 1961. Instead of convicting Eichmann based on documentary evidence, Israeli prosecutors summoned many Holocaust survivors to testify, a method that generated exposure but proved controversial. Reparations. Historians estimate that property losses to Jews in Germany, Austria, the Netherlands, France, Poland, and Hungary were roughly $10 billion in 1944, or $170 billion in 2022. This calculation excludes the value of labor extracted. Overall, the Nazis robbed around 10% of Jewish property from occupied countries. Survivors' efforts to seek restitution for their losses began immediately following World War II. There was an extra wave of restitution activities in the 1990s as a result of the fall of communism in Eastern Europe. Between 1945 and 2018, Germany provided $86.8 billion in restitution and compensation to Holocaust survivors and heirs. In 1952, West Germany reached an agreement to pay Israel $3 billion, about $714 million, and the Claims Conference $450 million, around $107 million. Germany provided pensions and other reparations to Holocaust survivors. Other countries have made reparations for assets taken from Jews in their countries. Most Western European governments returned some property to Jews after the war, however communist regimes confiscated many formerly Jewish properties, resulting in a lower total sum returned to Jews in those countries. Poland is the only member of the European Union that has not passed any reparation law. Restitution measures went short of restoring pre-war assets, particularly substantial quantities of immovable property that were never returned to survivors or their successors. Remembrance and historiography. In the decades following the war, Holocaust memory was primarily limited to survivors and their communities. The popularity of Holocaust memory peaked in the 1990s, following the fall of communism, and it became important to Western historical awareness as a symbol of the greatest human evil. Holocaust education, which its supporters claimed developed citizenship while reducing prejudice in general, became popular at the same time. Every year on January 27th, International Holocaust Remembrance Day is observed, though some other countries have designated their own Memorial Day. The Holocaust has been memorialized through memorials, museums, speeches, and cultural works such as novels, poems, films, and plays. Holocaust denial is a criminal felony in several nations, and it has been propagated by numerous Middle Eastern governments, people, and media outlets. Although many people believe that there are lessons or some type of redeeming significance to be extracted from the Holocaust, whether this is true and what those teachings are is debatable. Communist regimes minimized the issue of anti-Semitic persecution while ignoring their citizens' involvement with Nazism, a trend that persisted into the post-communist era. In West Germany, a self-critical memory of the Holocaust emerged in the 1970s and 1980s, spreading to other Western European countries. Holocaust memories have been extended to the entire European Union, providing both a shared past and an emotional basis for committing to human rights. Countries wishing to enter must participate in this collective memory. In contrast to Europe, American Holocaust memory is more abstract and universalized. Whether Holocaust memory advances human rights is debatable. In Israel, the memory of the Holocaust has occasionally been invoked to justify the use of force and violations of international human rights standards. The scholarly literature on the Holocaust is extensive, including thousands of works. After being generally dismissed by historians, the perception of the Holocaust as a unique or unfathomable event remains widespread among the general population. Clarification needed. Another point of contention is whether the Holocaust originated inside Western civilization or was an aberration of it. We poured our hearts and souls into each frame, hoping to take you on a mesmerizing journey through time. We're glad to hear your opinions. Did you enjoy the video? Was it informative, interesting, or perhaps even inspirational? We would love to hear from you in the comments section below. And, if you haven't already, please consider joining our community by subscribing to our channel. And, if you haven't already, please consider joining our community by subscribing to our channel. By clicking the bell button, you'll be kept up to speed on all of our latest releases, ensuring that you never miss out on another intriguing journey into the past. But wait, there's more. We want to hear from you. Do you have a particular historical topic that piques your interest? Leave us a comment with your thoughts, and who knows? Your suggestion may be the inspiration for our next video. So, friends, when you say goodbye, remember to like, comment, subscribe, and ring the bell. Your support means everything to us, and we can't wait to go on this historic trip alongside you. Until next time, be interested, stay connected, and continue to discover the treasures of our shared past. Cheers!